Welcome. I'm Hernan Murdoch. In this episode, we're going to take a look at the past and the future of this very exciting profession. So, as we think about the internal audit profession and where it has been, where it is, and where it is going, there are so many exciting things that have happened, are happening, and I am sure will happen because we're starting to see the indicators of that. So, to dig into this subject further, we have with us here Kathleen Crawford. So, let's talk a little bit about this. Hi, Kathleen.
Hi, Hernan.
So, as we think about the past of the profession and some of the dynamics that has brought us to where we are, what are some of the key pivotal events that have helped shape internal auditing as we know it today?
Well, in our case, this profession has been around for a long time. The Institute of Internal Auditors was founded in 1941, but in the last several decades, there have been some pretty significant regulatory events. I'm familiar with ones in the United States, but there are certainly a lot around the world as well. So I'd like to lead with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act went into effect in 1977, and it was consequent to a number of practices that were observed around the world by US companies who were trying to break into local markets and do some construction projects and other sorts of things, and maybe shortcut the process for approval. And back here in the United States, that was widely reported by our media, and it created something of a public outcry in the citizenry, which then led to this legislation being passed. So
If I
I
recall correctly, that was executives that had suitcases of cash to pay off government officials. Is that what happened then?
Yeah, that
Yeah.
was definitely part of it. That was definitely
Yeah.
part of it. So flying overseas and tempting folks to get into business with them because of those suitcases of cash. That is exactly
Right.
right.
Right. Very true.
Not all of them were so outrageous, but there were other instances that might have been a little bit more subtle, but the end result was the same, shortcutting a process that should have been more fair, and should have been more appropriate. So the basically the legislation is still something that can be we can still find ourselves in trouble if we don't follow the rules. So we want to be mindful of that. And I would say that the pattern of um, a situation that is outside the norm, widely reported by the media, leading to some kind of public outcry, is what Foreign Corrupt Practices Act started off. And we see, or we can see, a similar pattern with several of the other pieces of legislation that we're going to look at.
So this one had to do with forbidding the payment of bribes to
Bribes,
government officials to
right.
obtain or retain business, right?
and and unfair advantage,
Uh-huh.
because you're jumping ahead of the line, or there is no line, you're the only one in it. So it was unfair advantage, and to get into business uh, through less than open means, shall we say.
Okay. How about the federal sentencing guidelines? How did that impact the profession?
So the federal sentencing guidelines came about because, again, a situation in society that was widely reported by the media and created a public outcry. So white collar crime, it wasn't necessarily punished in the same way that violent crime was, and that was the concern, is that there were a couple of high profile cases where individuals were able to defraud folks from their money and defraud companies that they worked for, gaining a very substantial personal advantage. And the issue that was so galling to readers of national newspapers and national magazines in the United States is that they may go through the process of being prosecuted, and they may be sentenced, but the time that they would have to serve and the conditions in which they would have to serve would be basically less than a slap on the wrist. So the federal sentencing guidelines came about in the early 90s to make sure that that inequity was addressed, and boy was it addressed, because there were jokes about quote unquote federal country clubs, as the minimum and medium security prisons were sometimes known, and that is no longer the case. We would
If I
just
recall correctly, if I recall correctly, it also had to do with providing an incentive, so
Mhm.
standardizing penalties for similar practices, but also providing an incentive for organizations to be clear about what expectations and what proper conduct looked like.
Right.
So it also ushered in a wave of training, policy and procedures, expectations, performance monitoring, and so on, to make sure that an organization could defend itself if and when something happened. And if it were taken to court, the organization could show that they did what was, let's call it due diligence, or
Hmm.
prudent and reasonable, to instruct employees as to what was okay and what was not okay to do. And then the penalties will then be commensurate with the effort and uh, the individual who then acted as a rogue operator.
Hmm.
Is that
Hmm.
part of that as well?
That is, and it set the
Mhm.
stage for later legislation that we'll talk about momentarily, getting even more robust in that area. Um,
Okay.
there was this particular point here, fraudulent financial reporting research. This covers a decade of research that was done by, or rather, the research didn't take a decade, but a decade was researched by the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations, also known as COSO. And so the fraudulent financial reporting research here indicated that there were some significant issues with smaller companies, smaller organizations, in terms of people in higher positions of authority defrauding or gutting the organization itself for personal benefit. These were smaller firms that were not on any of the major exchanges, and so didn't get necessarily the same scrutiny that they would have got under FCPA or under even the federal sentencing guidelines, because they were sort of below the radar. But the
Mhm.
data shows that that without those kinds of controls that you just alluded to, without those expectations and a culture, I'll use that term again, a culture of proper behavior. There were quite a number of instances where investors were undone by the behavior of a small group of, like you say, rogue operators. So again, a pattern of some outrageous situation widely reported by the media, resulting in public outcry.
Okay.
And we also have the Blue Ribbon Committee. So this is in 1998. So now we're getting even more invested in setting up expectations. So the Blue Ribbon Committee came about because of cooperation between a couple of leading entities in the space of internal audit and public accounting, and really made sure to to kind of be the leaders on avoiding legislation because of setting certain practices in place, so that that we would be holding ourselves accountable and not relying on the courts to hold us accountable. So this is another instance where this is a better instance, actually, because from this was more generated internally. Let's look inside and see what we can improve about our own practices so that we don't get ourselves into difficulty.
Excellent, excellent. And what was the impact of Sarbanes-Oxley that came out in 2002?
Well, that was transformational. So everything before Sarbanes-Oxley was kind of a dress rehearsal, if you want my opinion on it. Sarbanes-Oxley was very, very wide-ranging, because at the same prior to the legislation being passed, there were 3 or 4 very large organizations that imploded because of poor business practices and bad behavior on leadership's on the part of leadership. So we had the Enron scandal, the MCI WorldCom problem, and there were several others as well. And so these things coming together at the same time led to very, very swift action on the part of the US Congress. So Sarbanes-Oxley really increased the credibility of internal audit. There are several sections of Sarbanes-Oxley that have been instrumental in transforming business practices and making sure that controls are taken very, very seriously at all levels of the organization.
Right. Yes, it has sections that speak to internal controls over financial reporting, sections about the strength of the audit committee,
Hmm.
the role of the board itself in overseeing internal and external auditors, the attestations made by senior executives, penalties for misconduct, quite a few things. And by the way, also requiring the installation of a whistleblower hotline or some kind of a
Hmm.
mechanism to capture allegations of fraud and irregularities. So that's an interesting look at the past. Now let's turn our attention to the future. What are some of the things that, as we look at the horizon, that are starting to shape as impact drivers as to how the profession might behave and what we may focus on and do in the future?
Sure. Well, I would say that when we think about the future, the first thing that I want us to talk about is assure, advise, anticipate. So we know from what we've been speaking about with regard to IIA standards that we have standards that cover assurance engagements and advisory or consulting engagements. I'm not saying that the IIA is coming out with anticipation standards, but I'd like people to think about if we know a lot about our organizations that we serve based on the assurance work that we've done and based on the advisory work that we've done. Do we now have a database or a compendium of knowledge about how things are working in the present that we might be able to leverage in terms of anticipating where the future risks might come from and what we might want to do about those future risks? Where are we going and what is happening in the larger world that we should be anticipating and be noticing
Mhm.
of? So, repurposing, for example, our risk events categories and making sure that they are meaningful and relevant to our organization and not just a rubber stamp on what we think general risks are. But can we anticipate where those risks are coming from and be a good advisor to management in terms of what we're noticing and seeing? And what we're hearing from our colleagues in other parts of the world and perhaps in other industries as well.
To be proactive. Very
Yes,
good. Right.
exactly.
Okay. What
Proactivity
else?
is the name of
What
the
are some of
game.
the other dynamics that are on the horizon?
Well, another huge one for us is upskilling both soft skills and hard skills. I've known a number of leaders in internal audit to say that soft skills are the new hard skills, and I would argue that that has real impact for me. That the ability to communicate, to be able to think creatively, to be able to think critically, and melding those things together is really, really important. So we want to have teams of people who are adept at many different things. We'd like to have people who are multifaceted and multi-abled. And how do we marry those things together so that we're building bench strength in terms of our team members? You alluded to something about this a little bit ago, Hernan, in terms of people identifying areas of interest and building some capacity in those different areas of interest. Specializations, but not to the detriment of the generalization that we need them to be available for as well. So upskilling in both hard skills and soft skills.
And soft skills involving a lot of time management, conflict
Hmm.
resolution, communication skills, teamwork, and various things like those. So,
And
what are some of
I'll
the
make a
other?
commercial
Yes.
for root cause analysis too. Yeah.
Absolutely. Critical thinking being very, very important there. What other dynamics are capturing our attention?
Well, the three lines model. So, a number of years ago, we knew this as the three lines of defense. It was a cooperative effort between internal audit groups and risk management groups in Europe that came up with this idea of identifying the fact that every organization has these different lines that protect them against things going wrong. So going back to the point about the regulatory events that we covered a few moments ago, these three lines are supposed to work in cooperation with each other, and this has been updated. We've taken this on ourselves, not wanting to be imposed from the outside, but can we think about the three lines as being very cooperative and like a Venn diagram that has a little bit of overlap, but not so much overlap that it's going to be redundant of each other. So we're talking about what happens at the leadership level within the organization, what happens within internal audit, and then what happens with that second line group in terms of management and maybe some specialized groupings like a risk team, a compliance team, and that sort of thing. So this updated model alludes to and suggests greater cooperation, collaboration, and communication between all three parts of or all three groups.
I believe that the three lines model also by removing the word defense also try to move us beyond just looking backwards and hindsight. And it also touches on what you highlighted earlier, which is anticipate, so
Yes.
foresight. So not just thinking defensively, but also value creation, not just value preservation, but value creation as well, which is forward looking. So as we turn out to technology is such a central part of our lives. What are some of the dynamics in the technological space that we also keep our eyes on?
Well, robotic process automation, this is an area that we need to become more acquainted with because it's not just the wave of the future, it's the wave of the present. So there's an enormous amount of effort that's being placed on replacing humans with robots, not because we want to replace humans, but we were talking about this earlier in terms of technology can do things more efficiently and certainly more consistently. And so what kinds of processes lend themselves to automation? And
Right, and those repetitive motions that in some cases humans will
oh,
make mistakes during data entry and so on. So, what are the things about automation? Do you think that artificial intelligence or machine learning are also
mhm.
important in our discussion
Yes.
about internal audit?
Indeed, indeed.
Okay, okay.
So we're all of these three things are coming together as areas that are of greater and greater interest to management and to our organizations. So it behooves us as auditors to become more acquainted and more not just acquainted, but more educated about what these might mean in the context of the organizations that we work for. Are these things likely to affect, or could we study these better and determine the degree to which management should or should not be involved in these things, and think about it's all about strategy. Really, it's all about strategy. What type of strategic direction? What strategic direction is our industry going in? Does our organization keep pace with that, or is it lagging behind? And as auditors, we should be alert to that and be informing management of what we're seeing in other sectors and what the better practices are around these very important areas that are on this graphic.
Excellent. Yes. So, as we're thinking about technology, as we're winding down that segment on this of the future, so what the organization is doing and how they're leveraging these technologies to advance the business itself, whether it's accounts payable and receivables and processing transactions and so on, but also what internal auditors can do with the technologies themselves as well. So, how we can improve our audit procedures by leveraging those technologies to identify anomalies, to identify outliers and patterns that maybe will escape the human eye. So thank you very much, because definitely as we think about how the past has shaped our present, and how what's happening now, and as we look forward, how the future is starting to look very bright indeed for what we do in internal auditing. Thank you very much, Kathleen. Really appreciate your help today.
It's my pleasure. It is an exciting time to be an auditor.
If you like this series, subscribe to the ACI Learning YouTube channel to enjoy more audit-related content.